the rail industry argues that less regulation allows them to make more money, that they can invest in safety. We do know derailments are less common now than they once were, but with longer, heavier trains carrying more hazardous materials, isn't the damage from today's derailments much greater than in years past?
Well, that's one of the issues that we're really concerned about. The railroad industry has been making these trains longer and longer, and they're actually pushing to be able to have those longer and longer trains staffed by smaller and smaller crews, down to one person in some cases, if they get their way. I don't think it's ever a mistake to err on the side of safety. That's why we're pushing tougher safety regulations as a department. We're also working with Congress, and we want to see more from Congress. Railroad companies are already extremely profitable. This is not a question of their ability to stay in business or to be competitive. They're doing just fine. They need to be willing to make these kinds of investments, and we're going to require a high level of safety, whether they're willing or not, because it's the right thing to do to keep communities safe, to keep workers safe, and to make sure that the goods we count on every day move around this country safely. Yes, derailments might be down from where they were 10, 20, 30 years ago, but I don't see how we could ever be satisfied with having derailments take place on a daily basis, as they continue to do and always have here in the United States of America. That's preventable, and we should be preventing it.
Now, another argument against new regulation is that it is expensive to incorporate new technology, and since virtually everything does travel by rail, increasing costs on the industry will ultimately lead to higher prices for consumers. Is that a valid point?
I don't think that's a valid counterpoint to safety. And remember, these railroad companies have been able to become extremely profitable. And, a big part of how they've done that is they've been cutting the human side. They're cutting workers. Far fewer workers work in the railroad industry today than just a few years ago, even as the volumes of cargo that are being carried have grown and grown. It would be one thing if this was the most expensive way to move goods, and the cost of moving goods on freight rail had gone through the roof, but that's just not what we're seeing. What we're seeing instead is that these Class 1 freight railroads have become wildly profitable and need to be willing to accept a higher standard and a tougher standard of regulation. I promise you, they'll still be perfectly profitable, and we'll still have manageable cost of shipping. Matter of fact, we've done a lot of work to drive down the cost of shipping in general. It's part of why inflation has come down. None of that has been at the expense of safety, and it never should be.
Now, you mentioned that you're pushing for more mandates, but we haven't seen that yet. And the Rail Safety Act, which is stuck in committee, leaves most new regulations up to you to draft. And you are a political appointee, subject to change if and when a new administration comes along. We are in an election year. So, and you're also susceptible to industry pressure. Is this bill too weak?
Well, this is exactly why I think we need both administration action like what we're doing and tougher laws that are on the books no matter who gets elected. That way we know that we have both of those layers working to make our railroads safer. I can tell you our administration from day one has been tougher on safety regulations than the last administration, which tended to be softer and more willing to move in the direction that industry was asking. We think that's the right thing to do. We think what happened in East Palestine almost a year ago demonstrates even more than ever why it's the right thing to do. And that's why we've done things like advance our rule on minimum crew size so that you would have at least 2 people on these trains that are getting longer and longer. It's why we're advancing a rule on hazardous materials and tougher requirements for what these railroad companies need to inform communities of as these materials move through them. But I got to tell you, we're doing what we can with the legal authorities we have, but it would be different if we had more of the legislation that makes it all possible. And we're coming up on 1 year since East Palestine. It's been 11 months, and that Railway Safety Act is still sitting there in Congress waiting its turn. Any member of Congress who was quick to talk about this issue a year ago should be even quicker to get on the record today and say whether they're going to support this bipartisan Railway Safety Act.
And we do know, I want to mention that 2-man crews are already an industry standard. So that being said, without more specifics in the law and calling on more actual mandates, won't industry lobbyists continue to fight to water down any new rules?
Well, look, that's what they do. Industry is always pushing to have more room. And look, we're not trying to impose any unreasonable restriction, but I think if you ask any reasonable American who doesn't have a financial stake in railway corporate profits, I think most Americans agree that if we move in any direction on railway safety rules in this country, that direction should be to get tougher, not to get softer.
Is there anything more that you think you could be doing before, we get to the next election, when and if a new administration comes along? Is there anything more you could be doing to push harder to get Congress to act and to get new mandates on the books?
Well, that's one of the reasons I'm speaking out on this issue right now. We've been largely focused on what we can do in-house internally as an administration, but Congress really needs to step up here too. It didn't take long after that crash in Ohio for some Republican and Democratic members, including from Ohio, to step up and propose this legislation, but it's been almost a year now. The members of Congress who are quick to get on TV and sometimes even play politics with this issue, where are they now? We need to know, yes or no, will they support the Railway Safety Act? In the meantime, we'll keep pushing on our end with every authority that we have. That means enforcements, actions, it means safety advisories, it means developing standards like minimum crew size and hazardous material standards, and it means continuing to push industry to do things that only they can do. I'll give you a couple examples. All of them agreed in principle to sign up for a confidential close call reporting system, but none of them have actually finalized that, and we're pressing them to do it. One area where we have seen improvement is around sick leave. I believe that safety is improved when you have adequate sick leave policies for railroad workers, because you don't want people showing up on the job when they're not 100%. A year and a half ago, very few workers had that protection. Today, I think it's about 87% of union rail workers at the Class 1 freight railroads. We really believe that should be 100%. We're continuing to push for that.
And another thing with new technology, a lot of these companies are not using the most up-to-date safety technology that could catch problems faster. So why are rail companies resisting even those simple changes? And shouldn't those be mandated, you think?
Well, we're looking at that too. You see newer technologies for inspecting things like track geometry, the conditions of wheels, cars, locomotives. And right now we see it as a both and. Sometimes the railroads are saying, look, this new technology is here, so we don't need inspections. We believe that for now, it should be belt and suspenders. Sure, use the technologies. You should be using them more than ever. But let's not drop the human inspections. We need to make sure that we have every layer of safety that we can, so that things like what the people in the region around East Palestine went through a year ago never happen again.
Wouldn't it be better to, because we've talked to some former FRA executives who mentioned, the human inspections are great as well, but what if you just mandated the new technology along with the human inspections?
We're assessing that right now. Look, the new technology, by definition, it's newer. There's more work that needs to be done in order to prove it out. Obviously, we only want to require something once we know that it'll contribute to safety. But that's an active area of research right now with the Federal Railroad Administration, because I do believe newer technologies can find things that would have been undetected with the older technologies. And as that capability proves out, we got to make sure that's part of the picture of how we make railroads safer. Think of all the technological improvement that our country has gone through in the last 10, 20 years. That should translate into fewer and fewer railroad crashes each passing year.
Right, because a lot of these technologies, our understanding is that, acoustic bearing detectors, things like that, the automated technology has been around for decades.
So it depends on the particular type of technology, but yes, some of these things are more proven than others. All of them deserve to be researched, applied, and when we think something is a must-have, we're going to go ahead and require it. But the requirements that come from our department, frankly, that should be the floor, never the ceiling. And we're looking for these railroad companies to do the right thing. And what they really should do is go above and beyond the minimum. We're trying to raise that minimum and get Congress to work with us to do it. Again, I can't believe that we could reach the 1-year anniversary of East Palestine and still be waiting on Congress to pass that Railway Safety Act, which is a set of things that we know would make a difference.
And Mr. Secretary, do you think we are any safer today than we were last February?
Well, I do think the measures that we have undertaken over the last year have made a difference. I believe that the safety advisories about these defect detectors have made a difference. I certainly believe that we are safer now that 87% of rail workers have access to sick leave and less pressure to show up on the job sick. compared to a year or two ago. I believe, though, that there's a long way to go. I mean, look, none of us should be satisfied living in a country that has 1,000 derailments a year, which is how it is and how it's always been. That's just not good enough. And that's why there needs to be more action from the companies, from us with everything that is within our power, and certainly from Congress at a time like this.
Yeah, and if the violation fines, are a maximum of just over 230,000, and these aren't mandated requirements, it's largely up to these private rail companies to impose these measures themselves, set their own, thresholds for hot bearing detectors and such. If it's not a mandate, how can the communities believe that we are any safer today?
That's absolutely right. These rules need to exist and they need to have teeth. Right now, if we catch somebody in a violation, even one that leads to a fatality, our ability to impose a fine around that is capped by law in the neighborhood of $200,000. That law should change, and that's part of the Railway Safety Act waiting its turn on Capitol Hill right now.
And you mentioned the lobbying, it happens, but what can be done to get through to Congress or to get past that roadblock, whether it's the Department of Transportation that's in charge, and then you have the FRA that is also in charge of the safety standards, but then you have Congress. So without Congress's authority, how can anything be done?
Well, that's right. We're going to continue using the authorities we have, but a lot of that is limited by law, and only Congress can change the scope of our power to regulate safety on our railroads. The reality is lobbyists have a big influence in Congress, and that's certainly true for powerful industries. The railroad industry has been one of America's most powerful since the days of Abraham Lincoln. But something that is equally, or I would think more powerful, is the voice of people who care about this issue, and people should be making their voices heard. We certainly hear those voices at the DOT, and I think Congress will too.
And we know that with the 20 cars that were carrying toxic and flammable substances, the train in East Palestine was not considered high hazard. So what should the standard be for a train to be labeled high hazard, and what difference would that make?
I remember standing literally in the twisted wreckage of those cars, smelling the fumes in East Palestine, thinking to myself, if this thing didn't count as a high hazard flammable train, what would? That's one of the reasons why both the congressional legislation that's being considered would make a difference, but also our own department and our Pipeline Hazardous Safety Material Administration is evaluating how to update those standards. As you can imagine, it's a very technical process. It involves a lot of science, a lot of chemistry, but the bottom line is that common sense tells us there need to be higher standards that encompass more hazardous materials than what we have today if that train didn't count as a high hazard flammable train.
And much of the discussion about East Palestine has centered around the hot bearing detectors and how many are sufficient to catch a problem before a train goes off the tracks. But in East Palestine, detectors picked up a rapid increase in the temperature of the wheel bearings, but they never hit that critical level to stop the train that was set by Norfolk Southern standards. So does there need to be a uniform standard for when a train has to stop that's based on something other than whatever each company sees fit at that temperature?
I do think that this is one of the most important questions that will be informed by the NTSB's report. They haven't yet put out their final report on the specific causes and findings from the East Palestine derailment. And look, I don't think we should wait on their report to take a number of these actions, but I do think that they will be able to give us a lot more conclusive findings on how to make the most of these defect detectors. If the technology for detecting them is already there and it did not prevent this crash, then the question becomes, what should change in terms of how railroads respond to the data and the warnings that come in from these detectors? And that different railroads may set different standards, but the question this obviously poses is, should there be a floor or a minimum that doesn't matter what railroad you are, that is set through regulation? And that's something that we're closely going to be closely looking at the NTSB data and the technical findings in order to inform.
And our last question now here, what specific mandates do you think that Congress should immediately pass that would have an immediate impact and actually stop a derailment like this from happening in another community?
Well, I think right now there is no reason to wait to implement those tougher fines, to lift those caps so that we're empowered to enforce with more teeth. I think there's no reason to wait to impose more requirements on communities finding out about the hazardous material moving through them. I think there is no reason to wait on the physical reinforcements and technologies that are called for in this Railway Safety Act. Again, it's been almost a year, and it should not have taken that long to get to this point where we're still waiting on that legislation to pass. Congress can always do more later when more data comes in, but Congress should act now.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time.
Same here. Thanks very much.